Alright, what is poppin', people? Today, this video may seem a little pointless, because as you'll notice, tiering update, June 7th. Been a little bit of time since this VR update was put out, but I still want to cover some of the shifts that we saw. Well, I say some of the shifts. I still want to cover the shifts that have been seen in this, because I believe that they're overall just indicative of how NUPL has developed. And I think some just general talk about the biggest NU-specific team tour of the year is kind of helpful to see. And despite this, being posted a while ago, a lot of these trends are still notable enough to mention now. As always, there's going to be subjectivity with some of these ranking changes, especially as you get to the lower ranks. So if your favorite Pokemon got unranked, as we can even see in this post right here, so Valley Steel got unranked in the update. We already see a post saying that, maybe re-rank it. Oh, 2 posts about it. Ooh, wait, not too bad. Hell, oh, and another post saying Machamp should rise back up. So you get what I'm saying here, right? There's always a little subjectivity, so always keep that in mind with these changes. Now, I think the big notable change that everyone's going to note is Flygon to S, because throughout this generation, a lot of us on the VR Council have been pretty adamant in saying Caparaja is the best Pokemon beyond a shadow of a doubt in the tier. You've had a couple of people go against that, like in the community at large, and even, I think Davon has said he thinks Glass J is the best Pokemon in the tier, and he would move Caparaja even down to S-. But at this point, we've finally decided, you know what, it's really hard to ignore NUPL usage for Flygon, so if we go there. Let's see. Here's this. So as we go through all the NUPL weeks, let's look at Flygon usage. So week 1, and keep in mind where you have completed 7 weeks, so that is over a month and a half's worth of time. But you can see here, week 1, Flygon was number 2 in usage, right behind Raj. And you're gonna start noticing a trend here. Flygon, number 1 in usage in week 2. Week 3, Flygon is number 1 in usage. Week 4, Flygon was number 1 in usage. Week 5, number 1 in usage. Week 6, oh hey look, it's number 1 in usage. And in week 7, you'll be really shocked to hear this, but Flygon was yet again number 1 in usage. And while its win rate does definitely go up and down at that over and under the 50% threshold, it still shows just how valued Flygon is, and I think we all understand why. It is the best ground type within the tier, doubles as a ground immunity, so you get an electric immunity and a ground immunity in one. That's just really huge. It's the most, I would put it as the most consistent defogger in the tier, mostly because I believe it's got the best matchup against the other Stealth Rock setters. You'd compare it with like Rotom Cut. I think if you're going to look at the another top tier form of hazard removal. It's also, really good as a Scarfer. I saw Mary Berry say that she thought Flygon wasn't, or she thought Flygon's like Scarf set was worse than DD. I don't think so. I think Scarf is still the second best set. I do agree with the notion that Scarf is still kind of weak, but I don't think you need it to be a really strong revenge killer for it to still be really functional. I think the big reason you use Scarf is because of how many things it compresses into one slot. So that's going to be a lot of the defensive traits, U-turn, and just it's still revenge killing a whole bunch of common threats. Things like, say, Talonflame, like Starmie, like Salazzle. Flygon's able to revenge kill all of these Pokemon really effectively. I say effectively revenge kill Talonflame as you have to rely on Stone Edge hitting, but the idea is that Scarf Flygon still revenge kills what you need it to. Does it struggle more to revenge kill, say, maybe something like a Celebi? No, because you have U-turn. Let me think of a better Pokemon. Like a Glass J, for instance. There we go, another setup mod that's just a lot bulkier. Sure. I don't think you really need to be able to revenge kill everything super effectively to still be a really good Scarfer. And then, of course, you've still got more fringe viable sets. I call them fringe viable. They're still really good, but you've got sets like Choice Band, you've got Dragon Dance, that are also really effective in their own right. And in another rise, of course, next up we got Diancie. Diancie's really just solidified itself as another really effective stealth rock setter and defensive presence within the tier. Really good answer to Pokemon like Salazzle, even checking Dragalge pretty decently, despite being a fairy type, which is always really good. And alongside Vaporeon, which we also finally are rising to A+, it's got Heal Bell, and Heal Bell's just really good this generation. There's no more Refresh. I think that plays at least a little bit into the efficiency of Heal Bell, because you can no longer have, or it's a little bit harder to maybe to find a dedicated status absorber. Within you, obviously, there is an exception. You've got mons like, say, Xatu or Celebi that can sort of be status absorbers. But Heal Bell is just really strong overall, especially with how common an in-use status users are. Because if we just look at the mons that rose and that commonly inflict status, well, you got Flygon, it runs Toxic a good amount of time, Vaporeon's Scald, Dripion's got Poison Jab, it could potentially set Toxic Spikes, Vileplume can fish for Sludge Bomb poisons, Mantine runs Toxic, Araquanid runs Toxic, Talonflame isn't shown here, but, you know, it's always running a status move. Get the idea. And then we can even elaborate a little bit more on Vaporeon. It's just a really common defensive glue at this point. And I think just to, like, note how defining it is on a lot of balance builds, it does warrant the rise to A+. Yeah, it always still struggles with being a really passive answer to Pokemon, and as a result, it's not as effective as, say, maybe even like a defensive Flygon, which isn't a strong mon, but still is able to keep up your momentum with U-turn, and usually isn't wasting too many turns. Same with like Talonflame, which also, you know, like Vaporeon, to be fair, can still take turns throwing out status moves to prevent switch-ins from coming in for all too free. And we got a big rise here, and that is Glastrier, going all the way up from A- to A+. And Glastrier's usage definitely does not correlate to this rise, and I think most people would immediately want to point that out. The big thing, though, for Glastrier, and why it's so good, is mostly because when you start looking at counterplay to it, it becomes pretty shaky. There aren't a lot of mods that switch into it too well anyway. You know, you've got like Arcanine and Quillfish and Jellicent. You know, you're seeing some real fringe viable mods that we have to resort to. We start talking about it. But in general, Glastrier is just really hard to manage. Now, offensively, it's still pretty reasonable to keep down, but a big thing Glastrier benefits from is just how tremendous its bulk is. Because of how bulky Glastrier is, like we mentioned with, say, Scarf Flygon, it's just so hard to revenge kill a lot of the time with like common forms of revenge killing. So you think of like Talonflame, Scarf Flygon, for instance. Sorry, gotta text someone. Oh god. Okay, there we go. But a lot of these common fast mods just don't threaten Glastrier. Yeah, Ice is a pretty bad defensive typing, but conveniently enough, these mons just don't run moves that take it out. Like, you know, Glastrier does not care about Talonflame's Flare Blitz. It's not OHKOing. And fortunately for Glastrier as well, it runs Substitute a lot of the time. So even like Will-O-Wisp from T-Flame isn't the end-all be-all threat to it. And so, despite that bad defensive typing, you're more than making up for it with the bulk still. And just common revenge killers, like we said, they aren't a lot of the time that threatening. Yeah, you still have got some, obviously. You got like Salazzle, for instance, comes to mind. And I want to look at the other ones real quick too, but that's kind of annoying. Oh, never mind, it's not annoying to get to. Excellent. Like, you want to talk about other common revenge killers? We can close the Nupl thread. But, like, Rotom Cut, that's not revenge killing me. Surfetched, fun fact, if you don't get a crit, you don't revenge kill Glastrier. Starmie, I don't think you threaten the OHKO. Toxicroak, probably do, but just the amount of Pokemon. Also, when I said Surfetch doesn't threaten it, I meant against Iron Defense Glastrier. Let me clarify that. +2 Defense Glastrier could actually beat down Surfetched, which is kind of funny. And yeah, I think it's a pretty good TLDR. Next rise up, we got Drapion. There's really not much to say about it, other than Dark types being really nice defensively in Inu. Just because, well, Ghost types are pretty good, I would say. I'm at least a huge fan of a lot of the Ghost types we have. And while Drapion doesn't want to necessarily try to check Golurk because, you know, Earthquake, you can still switch it to Poltergeist. And Drapion in general offers a lot of good ways to break down some of those more bulkier teams. We're not talking stall necessarily here, but just teams that do bring along a lot of those common quote-unquote fat traits to them. You got Knockoff to make constant progress, you have Poison Jab to consistently threaten poisons. Again, we mentioned Toxic Spikes sets earlier, and that doesn't even necessarily have to be like dedicated defensive sets. You can have things like T-Spikes Protect to attacks. Things like that are pretty decent. Next up to Decidueye. Again, Ghost types are pretty good. And we've even seen a decent amount of like Choice Banded Decidueye rise. Because, again, we talk about how a lot of the Pokemon that check Ghost types, you know, they're kind of... they're not the most effective. And Decidueye is able to capitalize on a lot of these Pokemon by threatening with either Leaf Blade, or in the case of Guzzlord, just a really strong Choice Banded U-turn, which if I'm remembering correctly does... it's either it does like 40 or it does like over half. But I'm gonna say 40 because I don't think you're 2-hitting Guzzlord with a 70 base power move, even if it's super effective. And yeah, Spec sets still remain really potent as well. Decidueye also benefits a lot because of Long Reach, meaning Talonflame isn't a mon that can just come in and try to threaten to burn versus you, which is really cool. And we got Vileplume rising, and in my eyes, some of this is because growth sets are starting to rear their ugly heads yet again. If you played Sun Moon Inu, you'll remember Growth Vileplume is an absolute just demonic presence within the tier. It was really good at just not getting KO'd by anything, and it being able to just take over games once you were able to set up enough. Strength Sap obviously augments that a lot because Pokemon like Caparaja no longer are really threatening to beat you down. And it just in general, Vileplume offers a lot of good to a team in the way of like disrupting the opposition. You've got things like Sludge Bomb Poison, the aforementioned Strength Sap, Effect Spores always really annoying for contact move users. Corrosive Gas is really nice, especially to support Pokemon that want things like Flygon to not have their Scarf. Maybe Flygon's not the best mod to mention there, actually. But you get the idea. Corrosive Gas more... we'd probably want to talk about that more with, like, a Steel type. So something like a, let's think. A Calm Mind DNC or something wanting to get rid of Copper / Bronzong's lefties. Something like that. We got a Xatu rise as well. Xatu's mostly just still sticking around. Yeah, we had the Light Clay ban. And HO, like, dual screen teams are definitely a lot less prominent, but they are still effective. And we're also just seeing more Xatu nowadays on, like, balance builds for its role as a pivot, which is cool to see. And, hey, defensive Xatu can block rocks against pretty much every common rocker. I mean, Bronzong doesn't deal with you too well. Caparaja, I think you just end up stalling out a lot of the time. Diancie, you can stall out Diamond Storm power points. And then, like, Mudsdale, if it's not Smackdown, then you are fine versus because it's never doing anything to you. Mantine rises as well. Not a mon that gets a whole lot of usage, but we are seeing some more specially defensive sets popping up a little bit. And those are pretty decent into Pokemon like Decidueye and Exploud. Specs Decidueye, let's again make that very clear. Which are otherwise a little bit of an issue. And now here's a big rise right here, and I think one that's important to talk about. Celebi, going all the way from the dredges of, you know, niche to a pretty just standard setup sweeper to tier. And it's really just coming down to the fact that in NUPL we've seen a lot more Celebi. Again, it's a mon that really appreciates Vaporeon being as common as it is, because you just don't care about Vaporeon. You nasty plot up to +6, you have Recover, so you don't worry about losing the long game. You've got Nat Cure, so you do not worry about getting status. really easy to make a late game situation where Celebi is going to do something, and it has a lot of leverage throughout early and mid. And yeah, your coverage, you do need a little bit of chip to actually take out Copper. And Bronzong obviously isn't weak to Aura Sphere, but it doesn't really matter when Bronzong, the most you can do back to is like Toxic. Celebi still definitely has some things that hold it back. I think the most notable of which being how like easily revenge killed it is, because its speed tier, not something super amazing, and in defensively, you want to talk about, you know, Glastrier and Mono Ice not being great. How about Grass Psychic being weak to like 7 or 8 types? Something insane, at least like that. Yeah, not fun to try to avoid revenge kills. So you do have to make sure you get the ideal state for Celebi to have as much freedom late game as you'd want it to have, but it's viewed as a lot more manageable nowadays than it used to be. Next up, Ninjask. It just does the same stuff as it always used to, man. I mean, I voted for it to stay B-, mostly because I think there's still a lot standing in the way of Ninjask and being as good as you'd like it to be. Primarily just the fact that we have a good few more Pokemon now that do sit all over Ninjask. Makes it a little bit harder for it to get late games. But fortunately for Ninjask, there are a lot of Pokemon that are common that still synergize really well with it. I think Surfetch would be the one that just comes to mind immediately. And so, despite mons like Diancie and Copperajah, for instance, being really common, you can still support Jask just fine. It's still able to U-turn a whole bunch early game. And even with Talonflame's Flame Body being kind of annoying for it, Cleric support not too hard to come by. So you can pretty easily throw something like a Vaporeon on your team if you really need to save it. And next up, Araquanid. Again, this is a mon that is rising partly just because of how good it is into Vaporeon teams. But I also do just find Araquanid to be pretty standalone a good mon. If you watched my video with AIM, the one up on his channel somewhat recently where we got rank 1, Araquanid, you know, we were firing off some strong old little water bubble liquidations, and it was putting in a lot of work. Araquanid is just a generally strong Pokemon that, you know, has got a good time against other common options like, say, Copperajah, like, say, Bronzong. It's also just really, really bulky, especially on the special side, and so you can even take some random super effective special hits from mons like, say, Rotom Cut. You can take some, like, maybe one neutral attack from an X-Cloud if you need it to. Not too bad a mod. Next up we got Quillfish. Again, Andy is a tier where there aren't too many good spikers. And so you get Quillfish kind of having a niche just from that. Also a good check to say, what's it called? Oh, I already forgot his name. Glastrier, there we go. I don't know, I forgot that. But it's got a good Glastrier matchup. Its matchup into Combat Hazard Movers isn't the worst either. It's not stellar, especially if you're into like a Rotom Cut. But at least in the defogged Flagon, you can always start into Scald. And in general, a lot of Pokemon that you would typically switch into Quillfish don't want to be hit by one of Scald or Thunder Wave. So you can dissuade some stuff reasonably well. Jellicent being ranked, again, this is a mon that I just don't have much experience with. But most people seem to like it for the fact that it's a good Glastrier answer. And is still just like a bulky water type with good durability. Now Druddigon, a lot of it had a lot of success, or not, maybe not a lot of success, but it had a good amount of success early on in UPL for these like Life Orb Sheer Force based sets, because Druddigon's coverage is really good. You know, you got moves like Gunk Shot, Fire Punch, Thunder Punch, Iron Head. They can make it kind of hard to switch into. And we still have seen some people experiment more with Stealth Rock based sets too. I do think it's fallen off a little bit, and like immediately around those early weeks, you did see a lot of people saying Druddigon should be somewhere in the B ranks. So you can see we have, you know, chilled out a little bit with where we feel it should be. But it is, you know, noted as a more respectable presence still. The Rhydon ranking, I don't know. It's, I think the best way to put it is it's like, you need a mon that sort of does Mudsdale-like stuff, but you also want maybe a more firm to Salazzle answer. This is Silvally Fairy, by the way. Can't tell. This is Silvally Fairy, and this was my nomination, partly. And the big reason for it was, I think on hyper offense teams, Silvally Fairy is not too bad. Multi-attack plus Rock Slide plus Flame Charge is pretty good overall. And I don't think it's that hard to support with those teams. You know, if you're talking about Pokemon you want to get rid of, it's really just getting Chip onto the Steel types. And HO does not have that problem. You've got a lot of teammates that can potentially do that for you, such as, say, Tyrantrum. So yeah, I thought we should re-rank Silvally Fairy. It's a mod that I had been consistently trying to keep ranked anyway, back when it was in the depths of C. And so I'm glad to keep it ranked. And then we got this Magneton ranking. Again, this is a mod that I haven't used, but I have seen it a decent amount. And I believe that most people are just like using Magneton right now because it does at least force damage onto things like Bronzong and Kaparaja. And I've seen a little bit of experimentation with even like Rabombi plus Magneton cores, and it's not been the worst. I definitely can't just shit all over those teams. They've been reasonable enough. Should we rank it? I don't know. I think I was the lone unranked vote still, but c'est la vie. And let's get into some drops, because I always think these are interesting to talk about. Machamp falls to B. And this isn't because Machamp's a bad Pokemon. It's just because Surfetch'd is so much better that it's really hard to justify putting Machamp on a team over it. Machamp is less durable, it's slower, its priority isn't as strong. And while you could say maybe it's somewhat easier or simpler to wall break with, in some regard, because you can spam Facade. At the end of the day, man, Surfetch'd is Scrappy CC, which is also incredibly clickable. I think it really just does come down to a matter of competition, and we aren't seeing the usage from Machamp really to indicate that it should be ranked all too highly in spite of that competition. And a Tyrantrum is another big notable drop in terms of just big wall breakers dropping on the VR. And it's not like... Okay, I actually might go so far as to say Tyrantrum is bad. I wouldn't. But Tyrantrum's another mod that's just not being given that much usage. That took me a while to say that. Partly because there are still a lot of head smash resists in the tier. And while Tyrantrum does have the coverage to deal with those, you really don't want to have to be using non-head smash moves. But with bonds like Flygon, defensive, like Mudsdale, like physically defensive Bronzong, all being really common, it can be harder for Tyrantrum to just go nutty like all over teams like it, you know, wants to. We never really did get that ideal meta for Tyrantrum once Beware left, which I think is a little sad. Now, the Stelmise drop is one that I'm a little bit sad to see, but one that I do think is warranted. I still view Dhelmise as a pretty good option, all things considered. The main thing is if you look at in-UPL usage, I think it's been used a grand total of twice, with both of those uses coming in week 1, and it lost both times. And it's not like it's super common on the latter either. And so it's just really hard to justify keeping it ranked so highly. You know, at a point, we do obviously acknowledge usage does not directly relate to viability, but it's still something you have to consider. If a mod just isn't getting used, then there's probably a reason for it. And I think with Dhelmise, a lot of it comes down to the teams that you would put it on aren't super common right now. That would be my at least first reason why I'd say not to put Dhelmise, or not to run Dhelmise. It's still a good option. Again, I will defend Dhelmise as a legitimately pretty good Pokemon in the tier. But I don't think right now is the time to be trying to push it back up into the A ranks where I was, you know, kind of pioneering for it to go to in, like, say, April. The Scavalier drops, this is really just a matter of competition from Raj and Bronzong, making it at times difficult to justify a Scav on teams. I still think it is a pretty good mod. You've got like Mega Horn knockoff Toxic Protect sets being pretty good. It's just, again, you do kind of have to go out of your way to build with Escavalier, I've found. At the same time, I mean, Diancie plus Escav is pretty trivial to put onto a team, so. It's a mon that I could see going back up one day, but for now I think a drop to B is fair. Aerodactyl, it doesn't like that there's a lot of usage of mons that check it. That's really it. It's not like it doesn't have the moves that it like to bypass certain mons. Like it has Ice Fang for Flagon, for instance. It's got Crunch for Bronzong, for instance. It's still just really hard to make as much progress with, though, as you'd like it to, if you're running maybe a more like wall breaker oriented set. And then Dragon Dance sets just end up struggling a little bit more with sweeping late game, because there are a good amount of Pokemon that can either, well, it's not really a revenge kill because, you know, Dragon Dance. But there are a good amount of mods that can take a +1 hit and then KO in return. Now the Psiimian drop, Psiimian's such a weird mod, because I think a lot of people are pretty mixed on how they feel about it. You either think Psiimian is really unviable, or you think Psiimian is a pretty good revenge killer. I think in a world where a lot of people are defaulting to Talonflame as their default speed control, definitely shifts the narrative in Psiimian, like against Psiimian. Because like a T-Flame, you go, okay, well how could Psiimian ever be good? T-Flame's so good at checking it, and there are other Pokemon that are really good right now too that check Psiimian. Like you've got Garbodor sort of being on the rise, you've got Dragalge still being really good, Sylveon still being really good, Vileplume, Xatu. Like, hey man, as long as I can press U-turn with Psiimian, I'll be happy. I think maybe, again, part of it could come down to Surf-Edged competition. A little bit of an issue for it. Yeah. I think Psiimian could be a mon that people just use a little bit more and then start feeling a little bit better about. Do try it out if you haven't. I think it's a legitimately pretty solid option. Weezing dropped. I don't know. Personally, I voted to move Weezing down because I think Garbodor is like the overall better poison type. And when you look at what Weezing's niche is, it's sort of hard to want to put it on teams over the other ones like Dragalge, if you're talking about like a T-spiking poison, or even just Quillfish and Garbodor if you're talking about a defensive, like physically bulky poison type. If you need both options in one slot super badly, then sure, I think you could justify Weezing pretty easily. Because, I mean, hey, it does both those things. If you need them both, then there you go. Weezing's like your only option. It's just really hard to find a situation, I think, where Weezing is more justifiable than something else. And we got Inteleon dropping, it's just a matter of, like, Vaporeon being everywhere. And just other mons at Soft Check Inteleon being everywhere. And Inteleon also kind of struggling to find a niche for itself that it just can really have a firm grasp over, where it's not competing with, say, Kingjar, Blastoise, or Starmie in that spot for. Virizion drops, this has to do with there being a lot of mons that are common that defensively answer Virizion and make it just really awkward to pick your coverage for. Unlike PU where Virizion can get away with just not running a setup move, I think the overall power level of Inyu is higher and makes it so you kind of need to boost. Otherwise, you're hitting like a wet paper towel. And so you don't get those great worlds of getting to run all of your dual stabs and then your Stone Edge plus Zen Headbutt. Yeah, that's really all I have to say about Virizion. Zoroark, it sucks! Most of it just comes down to Zoroark being pretty easy to revenge kill. It's not that hard to defensively answer either, with a lot of its checks being just super common. And I think in general, people just don't care about the illusion mind games. Like, it's not a valued trait, I don't think, for most. So yeah. Comfey falls to C. I think Comfey's pretty underrated, frankly, but it is hard for it to compete with, like, Sylveon. And then as a defogger, I mean, there's plenty of mons that kind of do what Comfey does in that regard, so yeah, there's that. Both Absol and Alolan I want to cover one because they were Pokemon that I nominated to get ranked. I think they're vastly underrated. I think Absol's really good as an offensive, just wall-breaking Dark type, because Dark It's really hard for Mons to actually check Absol because its coverage is just at that right spot where really the only things that are gonna want to answer it are like maybe a physically bulky Mon that's already knocked, or like a Mudsdale, which can be generally consistent into it even if it has to take the knock on the first switch. And then a Lil and Eggy, again, sure, you compete with Goodra and Dragalge, but you're a lot more durable than both of those because of Synth. I really just think people don't use these Mons, and so they don't have a great perspective on them. But that's my take. Gigalith drops, again, this is kind of a case of it's not getting used, and it, you know, it's kind of hard to justify using in the first place over the other top rockers of the tier. Like, essentially, when you talk about your best in-use Stealth Rock setters, it's going to be Copperajah, Bronzong, Diancie, and Mudsdale. And it's really hard to point to too many things that Gigalith has over them that would make you want to put it on a team. It's probably the best Salazzle check out of all of those, but it's not that overly important. And it Hitmonlee drops to C mostly because just terrain-based teams aren't super prevalent right now in the meta. And I'm going to speedrun these unranked nums because there's not much to say about them. Arctozolt just never really picked up, especially with no manual hail, or not manual, no auto hail. Espeon is pretty much just without a reason to be used with the Light Clay ban. Galarian Articuno, still, I think most people would still say it's a usable mon, same with like Indeedee. It's just they both struggle to do much of anything, or and justify usage over like the other two really good offensive psychic types in Starmie and Celebi. Sceptile, again, just terrain teams, not very common or good. Silvally Steel, usable, but again, kind of hard to justify, I think, in the eyes of many. And then Vikavolt, just, it doesn't see usage enough to where I think it's worth us calling it viable until people start really using it at a high level and having success with it. That's going to be it for this one, guys. Again, it was a little bit late considering when this update was posted, but I still think it's worth talking about because it does have some... This update definitely is cool to look at and see how NUPL stuff has affected a lot of these shifts. As always, I hope you guys are loving your life, having a good time, and I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.